Bien, je crois que nous pouvons désormais commencer maintenant que les aspects techniques sont réglés. Donc, bienvenue à cette... merci beaucoup. À cette session traduire pour la planète et peut-être même traduire la planète d'ailleurs. Nous savons tous que la traduction, c'est une affaire de franchissement des frontières, qu'elles soient linguistiques, culturelles ou autres. Elle a ce point commun avec les questions d'environnement et de changement climatique et aussi de durabilité, qui sont autant de problèmes transfrontaliers, voire transfrontières. Et donc la question qui se pose, qui est posée à travers cette session, c'est qu'est-ce que la traduction peut faire dans cette affaire? Comment est-ce qu'elle peut contribuer effectivement, apporter sa pierre à un solutionnement de ces questions. Donc nous aurons pour en parler quatre intervenants donc, qui vont chacun parler donc, quelques minutes, soit d'ici, soit du pupitre qui se trouve là-bas. Après quoi, nous pourrons avoir un débat donc avec la salle et aussi à travers les questions que vous n'aurez pas manqué de poser grâce à cette magnifique application Slido. Donc notre premier intervenant sera donc Mensur SERIFOVIC. J'espère que je n'écorche pas trop votre nom.
Comme les autres ont des présentations, peut-être il est mieux qu'ils commencent.
Aucun problème.
Si ça vous va, merci.
Aucun problème. Donc notre dernier intervenant, après concertation, sera Mensur SERIFOVIC. Donc, so do you want to be the first person to intervene, Titta?
Sure.
Donc, so I'll make a short presentation. Then. Donc, je traduis à partir.
Yes.
À partir.
Can everyone hear me? Is the mic working okay?
It will be working.
Constantly.
Donc, Titta MAJALA, vous êtes spécialisé donc, dans les affaires de documentation au sein de l'entreprise Vaisala Corporation. Yes, and as long as you're pushing that button, I can't speak anymore. So, donc, spécialisé dans l'émergence d'une culture de la durabilité. Votre préoccupation est la réduction des déchets, donc qui passe par une concentration sur les choses et les contenus notamment qui ont véritablement du sens et sur un recyclage intelligent. Enfin, donc, et vous pensez, vous avez bien raison, la traduction est affaire de coopération, le recyclage aussi. Vous pensez que le meilleur moyen d'y arriver, c'est par une saine gestion de la chaîne de production. Donc, je vous cède la parole pour 10 minutes. So, Titta, you have the floor.
All right. Let's see how it goes now. Excellent. So, pleased to meet you, everyone. A little bit about me first. So, yeah, my relationship to translation is it's been along me for the whole of my career. So I have a degree in English philology, and I tried some work as a translator when I was a student, and quickly realized that's not my core task that I would be working with in the future. But it has kind of followed me on my path when I've been creating content and managing different kind of content projects as a project manager. And currently I work for Vaisala as a documentation specialist. So I'm actually a buyer. So when I create content, I order the translations and work with the translation agency on the translated content as well. And we had this initiative internally that started about a year and a half ago, where we centralized all of our localization activities to one translation agency. And I was involved in kind of thinking about the process and the collaboration, and also choosing the vendor. And sometime during this year, I was appointed the localization area owner for the technical documentation weather area of Vaisala. A little bit more about that soon. So Vaisala is a company that manufactures different products related to measuring the weather and measuring industrial parameters or different things. So the weather business area is for measuring all of different kinds of climate and weather parameters outside, and the industrial measurement area manufactures devices for measuring liquids and gases and this sort of thing that can optimize the industrial production. So how Vaisala is then related to sustainability and climate change, I was trying to gather some kind of a collection of recent products and activities that are somehow related and tied to climate change, and following and monitoring it. And I was actually noticing that almost all of our products are somehow related to this topic. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see our CEO Shell signing a contract with Ethiopia for renewing the meteorological infrastructure. And in the middle, you can see a picture of a weather radar within the Bahamas during the Hurricane Dorian. And towards the right, you can see we have this AQT 400 series device that monitors urban air quality. And then downwards, there's the devices for directing glycol in de-icing aircrafts. And then in the middle, there's the probe for that makes it possible to use carbon dioxide for refrigerating purposes. So the monitor makes sure that the carbon dioxide that is harmful for people in large quantities, that the levels of that are secure and safe for people. And then on the right, there's the probe that allows or optimizes creating biofuel out of waste. So, yeah, as I mentioned, I'm a documentation specialist, and I'm one of the people working on creating content about our products. One of the elements with our products is that we have quite a versatile product base, as you may have noticed already. If you count it in a certain way, there's almost 300 different products, and they vary from these huge weather radars that you can see on the left to small probes, like that ones that you can see on the right. So there's a lot of different kinds of products. So the same approach may not be appropriate for all of these. We typically translate content into almost 14 languages, so the 14 languages are like the standard set. But of course, for some products, we don't translate anything. We just use our master, which is English, the US English. And we have almost 20 people ordering localization or translations, mostly from Finland, but also from other countries. And most of our content goes through quality validation. So the translations go to validation for our internal people, native validators. So they check that everything is okay in the final outcome. Sorry, now I skipped. So this topic was really difficult to tie into our everyday work in the sense that I tried to imagine how can translators and translations actually kind of impact the content and the sustainability aspect in our case. So I made this kind of a cake. So the purpose of this cake is to highlight kind of the way that we build our products and related content. So we of course build it from bottom up. So we have the product and our content creators work with the R&D teams, writing about it, designing labels and texts for the UI that is used for controlling the product. And usually, even though we start early on, after the product is frozen, there's still some time for creating manuals and web content, brochures and stuff like that. And then those are frozen, so we already have the base and the stuffing. And after that comes the translation bit. So it's the frosting on the cake. And the point why I draw the cake is that while you're doing the frosting, it's really difficult to impact the fillings and the base of the cake. So if you're doing the cream on top, you can't say that, I don't want the chocolate cake after all. Could you make it a strawberry one? So the possibilities for the translator can be quite limited. But it's not to say that it's non-existent. So what we are trying to do with our centralized localization initiative is to kind of find a way for collaboration. And that's been, I'm trying to see if how much time do I have left. So we've tried.
3 minutes left.
Okay, let's.
You can take 4.
Okay, so this slide shows how we emphasized, we took for granted that when we are selecting our agency, we would have the things on the left. But in addition, we were looking for these added value items that we really wanted to have. And we wanted to see our agency and as well as the translators to be able to take holistic ownership of the content that they are working with and provide innovative questions and solutions and kind of even challenge us to some extent. And kind of we wanted to make it fluent for us to order content, make it easier to lower the level for ordering translations. And we wanted to make it like a two-way collaboration, not just us pushing content to the agency or to translators and say, do this, but we want it to be like an evolving collaborative process. So I was thinking about David's keynote speech earlier and about the situation where you have the luxury of in-house translators and you can actually throw ideas around and kind of start creating the content together with a source creator. Unfortunately, that's not typically the case for us, but we did reserve, when choosing the agency, we did reserve the right for these transcreation items to have we asked the vendor if it would be possible to have on calls with the translators directly. And the agency we selected promised us that option. So not all of the translation service providers were willing to make that happen, but that was something that we felt is important just because of the reasons that David was explaining, that sometimes sometimes it's just not enough to get the order and the instructions, but you may notice something along the way, and then it makes more sense to have the call, because that saves time for everybody and makes more kind of higher quality end result. And here are some other ways of how we are trying to make the collaboration like a joint effort. So we've ramped down during the first months of this year the collaboration with a selected vendor, and now we have continuous operative follow-up meetings each month with the key stakeholders. So mostly that's like the agency representatives and the Vaisala internal stakeholders. And we have quarterly business meetings where those are face-to-face meetings where we discuss things and how like the overall translations are going, and whether they are going into the right direction in terms of the metrics we are following is the item 3, so the service level agreement and key performance indicators, sorry. Yeah, so we are following on-time delivery, but also language quality, which is estimated by the validators. And estimate accuracy, meaning the cost estimates that we get during the first request for the order, and then how much we need to rework the content after we get it back. So I think that was it for me for now. So.
Well, thank you very much, Titta. I think you deserve an applause. And this audience deserves an apology from myself. I operated on the assumption that we had interpreters in the booth, so spoke my usual French language. And in fact, I was wrong about that, so pardon my French. But you all understood what I meant at the beginning, I suppose. Titta told us in a few words that when it comes to ecology and translation, well, interaction is key, and this ties in very well with what we heard this morning. So it looks like we're in the presence of various ecosystems, and we want to make them sustainable and, if possible, interoperable. So one of the questions that arise in this context is translation part of the solution, as we just heard? Is it possibly part of the problem, or should we question our premises on what translation is and should be under more ecologically minded terms? Those are the kinds of questions that Michael CRONIN likes to ask. I don't know if he will raise them today. He'll tell us. So Michael CRONIN, our next speaker, is a professor of French in the Department of French at Trinity College, Dublin, director of the Trinity Center for Literary and Cultural Translations. And those two main axes are reflected in the very numerous books that he wrote. And you have the list in the program. He's a very well-known figure in the translation studies field, and I would like to focus more on his last publications: Translation in the Digital Age, 2013. Eco-translation, translation and ecology in the age of the Anthropocene. We are right in our subject here. So, Michael CRONIN, please, you have the floor. You, of course, you will speak from the pulpit.
And I don't make much sense. Oui, c'est bon, c'est ça. So basically what I'm going to try and do in the 10 minutes that I think I have allotted to me is I'm going to try and ask a question about what climate change means in terms of how we think about translation. Does it involve a kind of fundamental rethink about the nature of translation? Secondly, I'm going to look at a specific area in which I think it has a very real consequence. And thirdly, I'm going to try and explore or look at what are some of the potential solutions. Some of these solutions are doable, they're feasible, they're hard. Some of the other solutions are much more difficult, much less feasible, and may not be good news for many of us here in the room. But I just want to begin with a novel by John Lanchester, a British novelist called The Wall. This came out earlier this year, and basically it's a kind of post-climate change novel. Lanchester is imagining what Britain will look like after climate catastrophe. One of the consequences is they build a very large wall around the island of Britain, which does two things. It keeps the seas out and it keeps migrants out. And in that, if you like, that walled island, people have to carry out a kind of military service. One of the characters, the protagonist, reflects on his relationship with his parents. And you can see, none of us can talk to our parents. By us, I mean my generation, people born after change. You know that thing where you break up with someone and say, it's not you, it's me? This is the opposite. It's not us, it's them. Everyone knows what the problem is. The diagnosis isn't hard. The diagnosis isn't even controversial. It's guilt, mass guilt, generational guilt. The olds feel they've irretrievably up the world, then allowed us to be born into it. You know what? It's true. That's exactly what they did. They know it. We know it. Everybody knows. So, as one of the olds then, I've got to ask the question, looking at many of the youngs in the room here, what is the consequences in terms of how we think about translation and climate change? We do know that we are in a crisis. This is just one document among many from the Institute for Public Policy Research in London, where they basically say that the environmental change is occurring at an unprecedented scale and pace, and the historical disregard of environmental considerations in most areas of policy has been a catastrophic mistake. So if that's the case then, what does that mean in terms of how we think about translation? I would like to argue that one of the consequences is in terms of the kind of paradigms that we use for thinking about translation. What I would like to and do a very kind of quick sketch of this is a shift from what I call the ethnocentric to the geocentric to the terracentric paradigm. And part of this, of course, will be slightly autobiographical, which is that for many scholars, translation scholars, for many years, what they looked at was primarily how translation operated within nation states, how it operated within communities, how it operated within cities, gatherings of people, and so on. In other words, what did translation do in terms of affecting social, political, religious, and cultural change in the society? And the kind of frame of reference was very much within a specific community, within a specific nation state, and so on. So although these scholars looked at the influences from elsewhere, by definition that's what translation does, the kind of unit of examination, unit of inquiry, tends to be bounded by a specific political unit. Then what we get in the 2000s is a kind of shift, what I'm going to call the geocentric paradigm. The geocentric paradigm is one where we look at the transnational flow of ideas, of people, of information, of bodies of knowledge, exactly what the Commissioner was talking about in his speech in German this morning. It's very much that kind of geocentric paradigm representation of translation. What I will argue is that what we need to think about now is what I'm going to call the terracentric paradigm. And the terracentric paradigm is what, or in what way, does translation, as it's currently practiced, have to factor in the notion of climate change? Or how would translation contribute to thinking about our relationship to the environment, to other species, and so on? This is a very, very complex issue with many dimensions to it. One of these issues, for example, would be about interspecies communication. What does translation have to tell us about speaking and communicating with other species that we're destroying at an unprecedented rate? And the vast majority of animals that we consume on our plates are held in conditions that are close to criminal. So what would a translation mean in terms of interspecies communication and a change in viewpoint? But I won't talk about that. What I want to talk about is something that I'm going to call the resource unconscious. A number of years ago, a book by Ethan Zuckerman, who is the head of the MIT Civic Media Lab. He wrote this book called Rewire. Basically what he did is he carried out a series of ethnographic studies where he looked at one of the things that the internet was supposed to promise us is that it would open up our minds to information, ideas, languages from elsewhere. What he found when he looked at people's actual internet practices, the vast majority of people looked at material in their own language, from their own country, produced by their own compatriots. In other words, the electronic frontier turned into the digital backyard. So what he argued then was what we need are more and more translators. What translators do is these are the people that will turn connectivity into connection. And so therefore, they provide a hugely important role, which has also been argued by Richard Baldwin in his book that came out a few months ago called The Globotics Upheaval. This, of course, is very, very good news for translators. It's the kind of thing that we like to hear. But something perhaps we don't like to hear is an issue that was raised by the young Belgian philosopher Pascal Chabot in his book L'Âge des Transitions, came out in 2015. What Chabot argued is that basically what we have with energy is a kind of a black box problem. He said if you look at the literature of classical antiquity, one of the primary sources of energy in classical antiquity are slaves. It's human labor. How many texts do you find in classical antiquity that talk about slaves? Very, very few. How many great works can you think of in your language about fossil fuels? A few poems by the Romantics, Zola's novel about the mining community, something that has powered every single aspect of developed societies in the last 2 centuries is almost completely absent from our cultural record. In other words, all these energy sources are buried in what Pascal Chabot calls the black box. And indeed, if we look at one of these black boxes, if we look at a kind of typical lab desktop computer that we have on our desktops, we find approximately 15 different metals in it. 4 of these are hazardous, 7 of them are rare metals. Our smartphones contain something like 30 different metals. Something like 10 million of these are either discarded or replaced every single month in the European Union. 73% of IT devices are recycled in what are considered to be hazardous, dangerous and environmentally destructive conditions. There is an exponential growth in the use of these devices. There's the privatization of the use of, more and more people, if you like, possessing these. The continuous growth in data centers. Data centers alone last year consumed more energy than was produced by renewable energy outputs in the US. It was a factor of 3 times larger than what was possible. So when we have the kind of the circulation of energy between end-use devices and network infrastructure, then there's the whole energy consumption in a manufacturing process. We have continual energy consumption. These are the tools that are absolutely the heart of what we do in our practice as translators. There's the growth in the consumption of streamed content, the culture of obsolescence, the shift from fixed to nomadic computing. The slogan of this conference, our gathering, is translation all around us. The problem when translation goes all around us, when we shift from fixed to nomadic computing, is that our energy consumption begins to increase dramatically. If I plug in an Ethernet cable and use that as 0, and I move to 3G, my energy consumption increases by a factor of 14. When I move to 4G, my energy consumption increases by a factor of 23. So what we have then is our own black box problem here in our practice as translators. So, since I have 2 minutes, I'm going to try and suggest 2 ways in which we might address this problem. One, as I say, relatively straightforward, the other perhaps less so. The first is, of course, we could design our IT devices so that we use much fewer precious and hazardous metals. We could end non-sustainable recycling practices. We could encourage modular production of IT devices so that it's much easier to repair and allows different components to have different uses. We could have standard compatibility of screens, batteries, chargers, etc. And we could move to low-tech networks that have been tried out in places like rural Catalonia and parts of India. So this is what I would call the, if you like, the supply side solution to these problems, the shift towards redesign and low tech. The much more problematic side is demand-side ecology. If you look at, for example, Linebridge, this is a classic defense of why we should engage in translation, in localization. The reason that you should localize is that you can sell more goods and services. This is exactly at the heart of the exponential growth in translation, is the localization need to sell more goods and services. The problem is, can our planet support that? Can we support a culture of infinite growth? Is it possible to have this kind of ever-receding horizon of growth in the production of goods and services? And if that is the case, then, if we need to think, if you like, about solutions from the demand side, do we need to think ethically about how we use this scarce resource called translation? This resource which consumes energy, which consumes materials, which has a material cost, there's nothing immaterial about it, then do we have to ask ourselves some hard questions about what it is translation does and how, as translators, we are complicit in a kind of problem that is ours as much as anybody else's in the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And well, it's heartbreaking to have to stop all those fantastic insights, but that's just the way it is. So from industry with Titta MAJALA to conceptualizing translation and climate change with Michael CRONIN, we will now move to regulation and multilateral action from governments and international bodies. Yes, there is a logic to this session. So our next speaker will be Damien MEADOWS. I hope I'm not pronouncing it in a horrible manner, who is an advisor for the Directorate General Climate Action, the infamous DG CLIMA at the European Commission. Damien MEADOWS is the advisor on European and international carbon markets at the European Commission. He's been involved in developing market-based responses to climate change since 2000, included as head of the European Commission unit for the international carbon market, aviation, maritime, and as deputy head of the unit responsible for EU emission trading systems. He's most notably been involved in the drafting, negotiation, and implementation of various international instruments, and that's where I suppose a translation gets in, because all those fields are centered on mitigating climate change, and this time translation is instrumental, I guess, as a mediating tool in all those contexts. So, Damien, you have the floor for 10 more minutes.
Thank you, and I'll follow Michael's lead in taking the energy up here. First of all, a big thank you to anyone who's translated anything that DG Climate and I and my colleagues have produced in the past. I apologise also for all the jargon that's sometimes there in the UN talks, in the EU talks. But we would have no EU legislation without translation, so it's been essential. The John Lanchbury book sounds very interesting because people knew about the seriousness of climate change over 50 years ago. Lyndon Johnson told the US Congress that his generation had changed the atmosphere like no previous generation. Jacques Chirac says exactly the same as Greta Thunberg. Maybe it wasn't translated into English well, but the house has been on fire for decades. And this is, I've worked in this area around 18 years. It's a very difficult area, and it's a difficult area to maintain hope. If we're to recommend books, there's a very good recent one from Jonathan Safran Foer called We Are the Weather, where he discusses the difference between knowledge of science and the situation and actual belief. Belief leading us to act on it. Also, there's Amitav Ghosh, who's written The Great Derangement, which he normally writes fiction. This is a non-fiction book, and he's looking at why so few people have written about the most important issue in the next 30 years. It's very good. Doesn't necessarily make us less worried. If you look at the chart from Mauna Loa of monitoring carbon dioxide emissions, I was there in the early 2000s. We're now off the chart at 415 parts per million. We are in the Anthropocene. We have never been here before as a species. And of course, all other species are coming along with us on this ride. So, the next speaker will probably talk more about the UN Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol. We've been trying for 20, 30 years to get a robust international response, and French diplomacy was brilliant. The Paris Agreement is a triumph, and a triumph in terms of communication. However, we are heading towards 3 to 4 degrees climate change by the end of this century. Basically, Europe is multilateral. We wanted everyone in the world to take on commitments, starting with the richer countries. America wasn't so into that. China, India, their emissions have been growing greatly. So the Paris Agreement sounds wonderful, but it is a bottom-up agreement with everyone pledging what they feel they can do. And if you look at the next slide, that means we're heading towards 4 degrees climate change at the moment. Much more needs to be done. It would be wonderful to have something better at the international level. It really would. And there's reports here brought out by global scientists showing that we really should be limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees if we don't want to risk irreparable consequences. That's not likely at present. In this context, Americans have often been more fluent than Europeans in expressing what needs to be done. The quote at the bottom of this slide is from a US president. Any guesses which one? Not the current one. I don't think he uses the word myriad, but it was Obama, and he and John Kerry and others were very clear how, given we don't live in a communist system, we have to get prices right. We have to make pollution more expensive from ships, from aviation, and then businesses such as Titta's one and businesses right across the world can put their efforts to work in reducing emissions. This cartoon from the Washington Post. You can do all the research you want forever, but if you don't make an actual market reason to use these, then they're not going to be taken up, and we have to change society radically in the next 30 years. Europe's done this through carbon pricing. It's not because we like markets, it's because we know we need the Americans also to do this. They emit much more than us. The Australians as well. And China, what's quite surreal is that China has learnt so much from Europe. We've had all our works translated into Chinese, I'll say more on that, but they have referred to Europe as their teachers in terms of putting into place climate measures. The next slide, this book is freely available online. So have I missed out a slide here? Where is it? There's a slide missing, unfortunately, from Damien. Okay, let me just jump. There was a slide here about words mattering, because there's two examples showing the importance of translation. When I drafted the original law back in 2000, it was called an emissions trading scheme. I read a transcript from the US Senate, and they actually, I think it was John Kerry who said, in Europe, scheme is not a bad word. In America, scheme is a very bad word. Not in Australia, but or New Zealand. But they think scheme is basically a scam. And a couple of years ago, we changed our European law to say the word scheme is replaced by system. Our legal service said to me a decade ago, if you do that, Damien, you have to write in the law why you're doing it. You're doing it for the Americans. We backed off at that time, but European Parliament and Council voted to say it's called a system. This was a massive problem for the translators, because what do you do if in French or German you already have the word system? You have a sentence of translation that says the word scheme is changed to system. So on this missing slide, in some languages they said cette modification est sans incidence sur la version française, but in Maltese, in Portuguese, they changed it. And one of my Spanish colleagues, he wanted to change it from régimen in Spanish. It ended up staying the same, but it did change in Portuguese. So it's a minor thing maybe, but it's still important in terms of framing, and Europe changed the name. The other thing is the difference between words like should and shall. We cause problems for translators because in Europe we had the word should in the operative text on how member states should use what's now 40 billion euros that's come from carbon pricing. They do use most of this money, thank God. I mean, in France, it's used for insulating social housing. Germany has many funds. But thanks in part to the United Kingdom, the word shall was unacceptable. So people were obliged to accept a should, and any translator who changed it into shall, I would applaud, but it wasn't meant to be. Likewise, Obama, as a lawyer, held up the whole of the Paris conference because the word shall was in the French text in terms of each country, I think it was, shall progress in terms of its climate commitments. And it ended up being the word should because of the power of the United States. If anyone's interested in reading more on this, then a book that my Director General wrote on these slides, we've had it translated into a whole range of languages. The Chinese version, I think, has been very popular because the Chinese are working so hard on doing this. In Korea, they've also followed Europe's experience. On the right-hand side, we have a new book that's being published in the next week or two. If any of you are involved in writing, I mean, we bureaucrats are not writing as interesting books as Michael was referring to. They're not as readable, but we are trying to communicate because climate denial is largely an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon coming from the United States. Naomi Oreskes, The Merchants of Doubt, there's some very good books on climate denial. In China, in India, in Brazil, well, no, actually, I take back Brazil, but in much of the world, I mean, climate change is a reality now, and people know how much needs to be done. But diffusing this information, I think it's vital to go faster than we're doing. Thankfully, the new head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, she's well informed on climate. She's one of the first presidents I've seen who's been interested in this policy. And she's said some very clear things, that we have to make pollution have a price. that all sectors have to contribute, because when I've worked with aviation and shipping, well, yesterday a director I was sitting by said shipping is the invisible sector. It's invisible no more. It pollutes as much as 140 countries, and they have zero tax on their fuel. This is now in Europe's sights to actually do something here. A final word, I think, is on action. I mean, I think Michael and I probably worry you all in terms of the picture of climate change. It is worrying. I mean, individual actions matter. I don't have a car. I try to be vegetarian. I mean, all these things matter. But the key thing is to get government action. I mean, the fault is with governments for not having put in place the systems that need to be. When it comes to ozone destruction, we have done this through the Montreal Protocol. When it comes to climate, we are sadly falling short at the moment. So around the world we have carbon pricing, but it's not enough and it's not at strong enough levels. And final slide is just there's plenty of resources on DG CLIMA's website as well, most of them translated into all the EU languages. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damien. So with those first three presentations, I suppose you already have plenty of questions. You will be, of course, able to present them publicly, but you can also use the Slido system to do that. So while you're asking your questions or preparing them, we're talking about multilateral instruments before. We'll now take an even larger view. We're going to leave the EU for the UN. Yes, there is a logic here. With our next speaker, so Mensur, who's head of the document unit at the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So Mensur is the right man in the right place because he started out as a translator, editor, and project manager for translation firms in New York, where he developed an affinity for exploring how to best plug the latest software into translation and text production workflows. And so he's, well, I'm sure he has a large number of things to say on those aspects. So, Mensur, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to stay seated. I hope that it's not going to affect my energy levels too much, but I'm sure Nicolas will give me a little prod if I start snoozing. I'm not going to talk too much about the UN Climate Change Convention, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement. I think your energy levels might go down if I start doing that. But I do want to touch on a few things that hopefully will be of interest to you. You've heard it, you know it yourselves, you've heard it from all the other speakers. Climate change and tackling climate change, it's a huge, very complex problem. And when it's dealt with, or at least in the intergovernmental process, which is kind of where I come from, in only one language, without the translation, this basically can even increase complexity. This can make it even harder to deal with for a lot of countries, for a lot of stakeholders. So translation is important in the process for many reasons. Many of them are fairly obvious. There's, of course, the political importance. People want to see that the UN is treating all the major regions equally. There's inclusiveness in the process. Building consensus is a very important part of the negotiations. Building trust, which sometimes can be lacking. And, of course, showing regard for cultural sensitivity. When for some countries, for some stakeholders, not having a translational language that I can understand, because most of the stuff is done in, most of the work is done in English. Not everybody understands English or can read it well. That can be a huge handicap to participation. Pooling of resources. Some countries pool their resources through negotiating groups so that they look at different agenda items, or they have, or they are represented by people who are well versed in the process and certainly can understand English, but ultimately the capitals need to get the translation in the language that they need. Of course, with the UN, it's only 6 official languages. We can't deal with all the languages in the world, which is unfortunate, but it's a reality. And for the capitals have to get the text in the language they need, and especially when that text is used in a decision-making process, it's an even greater imperative. So yeah, climate change, very complex, and often our texts, our negotiated texts, don't really make it easier. You're probably aware that the discussions and negotiations are very difficult, contentious. Many sentences, paragraphs in the decisions and conclusions are reworked endlessly, where you get essentially, and decisions and conclusions are adopted by consensus. So creating that consensus often involves having text that can be quite vague because different people, different parties involved, or negotiating groups want to read different things in the text. One can say that's a bad thing. I mean, I'm remembering what Commissioner Oettinger said this morning about precision in the text being important as a sort of legal basis, and of course that's the ideal. But in fact, many times in our process, at least for the negotiated product text, less so for the background material, it is exactly the absence of that precision that makes it possible for almost 200 countries and parties to adopt a text. This is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's basically so. I mean, you can. It's essentially for many paragraphs that are fairly vague. You can have different readings. You can have essentially a spectrum of readings. It's not, that text is not a specific data point. If we think about it mathematically, it's more kind of a range, and it's a spectrum. If those readings are kind of moving in the right direction, that's okay. You know, it's okay to kind of bring more people on board and allow them to interpret things in their own way, as long as it's moving in the right direction, because ultimately that will result, hopefully, in a spectrum of policies and measures at the national and regional level, and that is what we need. We need all kinds of solutions, all kinds of policies and measures, as long as, of course, they're moving in the right direction and not taking us backward. And, of course, this is where, when we start thinking about translation and translators, it can be quite difficult to interpret that text, to decide, well, what exactly do certain sections mean. The translators are not privy to all the information. They don't have always the full context. That, you know, from our end, we try to convey that to the translator. It's not always possible, especially during negotiations. Many things are done in a rush with high pressure. So there's not a lot of time also to consult colleagues and figure out meaning. This also means that at least at that level, until later on, there's a bit more time and the translations can be revised, that this original spectrum that's in the English is broadened even further by translators in different languages interpreting the text in their own ways. So the spectrum is even broader. And again, that's just kind of an ever-widening circle. But again, since we're trying to allow countries who ultimately whose circumstances can be very different and who have different imperatives and a situation back at home, to see something in the text that they can use nationally and to put themselves behind the text, widening that spectrum is not necessarily bad. A few more points. So the latest instrument that my organization administers is the Paris Agreement. And what's happening now under the Paris Agreement is a certain decentralization of activity. So the idea is, yes, like Damien said, it's a bottom-up instrument, and it's about getting as many actors and stakeholders on board as possible. So in a sense, when we look at the pool of actors and stakeholders, there's a fragmentation, And that means that whether it's technical guidance or knowledge or policy text, they need to reach an ever-growing number of actors, of stakeholders, whether we're talking about governments, national or subnational, academia, technical experts, etc. And another point is that it's related to this decentralization, is that as the research evolves and also as the public discourse on the subject gets louder and louder, we're seeing now, I mean, just the other day with the issuance of that bioscience report, where I forget the exact name of the body, but a large number of the world's climate scientists basically proclaiming a climate emergency and giving policymakers a number of indicators that they should act on, that the discourse on climate change is touching ever more aspects of life. It's starting to really get into things that people value the most or that are most important, things like mobility and food. I mean, what's more important than food, you could say, even for some family planning, etc. This, as even in our process, which can be, of course, a lot more political and where the text is a lot drier, but especially in the more kind of on the implementation side, as these texts also make it in translation, this means that the responsibility of the translator grows because the public is increasing, and again the value or the importance of some of the terms and some of the concepts that are being dealt with is really lie at the heart of some of the things that are the most important to us and that are the sort of basis of modern life.
You still have 1 minute left.
Okay, that should be enough to just give you a few things on the more from the translator perspective. Mostly we work with the translators at the UN office in Geneva, which is a very committed and knowledgeable team of professionals. And to give you a sense of what is important, they're saying, well, of course, and this also ties to the discussion this morning about specialization, that you really, at least our text, especially negotiated products, they can be difficult to translate. So for them, that specialization is very important. You have to understand the science, of course, of climate change. You have to understand the research, but you also have to understand the UNFCCC process, which often can be even more complicated than the science. And also, because they're often translating under pressure, it can be difficult because there isn't enough really time to give them all the context they need. And of course, with dwindling resources as well, and fewer translators and more text to be translated, there's less time to really study things in detail. Some of the translators are frustrated in a way because they're mostly translated either these negotiated texts or background material, what we call the official documents, the parliamentary documents that are prepared for the session. And they feel that those documents tend to have, those texts have a more limited reach, and they would love to kind of work on things that have basically, that are reaching more people and kind of helping not just negotiators see the light, but also those segments of the world population that are still in the dark about climate change. And just kind of a final thought that some were also that some of the translators were also sharing that basically, and I think it's fairly evident that in some places like Europe, there's a very active media interface in a way between public and science communities. Some can say, for example, the Extinction Rebellion, that BBC or other outlets are not reporting enough about climate change, but I think it's still a lot better than what you see in some of the other parts of the world. And to some degree, that also there's a language aspect there. It has to do, for example, with some of the most prominent texts and reports not being available in other languages. For example, the IPCC 1.5 degree report, which was very publicized. At least the last time I checked, it still hasn't been translated. Some of the delegates were complaining that a year later. Volunteers are pooling resources, trying to get it translated. Academics are saying we can't because it's not in the language we write in, we can't incorporate it as a reference, so it's a big problem. So this is kind of a point that you see everywhere now, that the multilingual dissemination of research really is critical. And I wonder, and of course, the UN, my organization, the UN in general, should be better about this. Often it's a resource question, sometimes it's just a being creative and figuring out the best way to do this. And I also wonder if, especially since compensation models, et cetera, are changing, that if, and there are many parts, many sort of industries and businesses and things that, or activities that in the past were remunerated on a more classical level, that these days operate more on a donation and fundraising level. And I wonder if some of this research that's so critical to disseminate more globally and in more languages, if we're going to have maybe some platforms, despite the energy use that having such platforms might entail, where various stakeholders and organizations, including mine, that are interested in having these very important texts, almost done, very important texts in multiple languages, where they can basically say, yes, we want to have that, we donate, where people are pooling resources, which of course helps on the financial side, but also would help to basically distribute some of the risk, because one of the reasons that some of the things don't get translated is because it is so political, and dealing with it in English can be extremely difficult, but once you get it into more languages, then you can be seen as taking on additional responsibility, and you have to deal with the comments and the translation, et cetera. So.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for your patience.
So, do we have a new ecological paradigm in translation, or a new translational paradigm in ecology? We could spend an entire international conference on those questions, and it could be a good idea to do so. However, here and now we have only very few minutes left. I'm afraid Slido hasn't been very productive. Last time I checked, there were no questions on Slido, but there are questions, I'm sure, on the floor. Jos.
Hello. Considering that as more and more companies are being bought over, there's a lot of consolidation in the translation industry, and there's more moves towards Industry 4.0, as it's called, that has repercussions on work processes, and more use of neural networks, particularly with companies like Lionbridge and Unbabel, especially those that are externally funded by venture capital. And considering that each neural network, according to a paper by Struble et al. From this year, causes an output of CO2 equivalent to the lifetime of 600 cars, there's a requirement for what Michael has called a great regression by the sound of things, and I wanted to know what the panel think a great regression would look like for the current translation industry and the technologies that we use.
I don't have an answer, but I think I was thinking about the related things. So to simplify, Michael's comment was to localize is to sell more. So I was thinking that maybe the implications also depend on what exactly you are working with. So I was curious to know what the answer is. Is the answer to stop localizing altogether, or to be more conscious of the context of what you are working with, and to think about the big picture, so to say? So, for example, let's take Vaisala products. The examples that I mentioned, they are just products. The secret source of the magic is in the application. So how to use them, not only for measuring, but also for predicting, and to be able to use that information wisely is how you get to have an impact, like a positive impact. So I was just thinking that for translators, that means also that if you're working with something like that, you're an integral part of affecting the user experience and making sure that the people who are using the device are able to get most out of the product and are able to make these wise decisions. So I was just thinking that it kind of depends on the context of what the kind of the big picture impact actually is.
Since we started 5 minutes left, I suppose we can use 5 minutes for a few more questions and comments. Anybody? Well, I've got one then. I'd like to go back to especially to what Michael said, presenting, asking the question of translation being a common public good, which ties in with what everybody at this session said. I was wondering how does that fit in with the necessary process of professionalization? In just a few words, of course. Anybody? Or anybody in the room?
I think there's one thing that we haven't touched on, which is the whole question of what I call data extractivism. I mean, one of the things that's, that has brought us the kind of sorry position that we're in at present is that kind of extractivist approach to the planetary resources, that you kind of extract, you mine endlessly, and there isn't a kind of an attention or mindfulness or an awareness of just how finite these resources are. But I wonder if the same kind of extractivist mentality is not there in the case of translation. One of the things that struck me in Richard Baldwin's book, he talks about what happens in 2016. That Google have this immense kind of computing power. They've got this deep learning technique, and what they desperately need is the data to feed. And then what happens, of course, is that the United Nations, the EU, make these data sets publicly available. Now, all of these data sets are publicly funded. They come from public monies from different countries. But then these are monetized by the wealthiest company on the planet. And one of the things that a question I would ask is to what extent translation labor becomes part of this kind of extractivist industry. In other words, that the translation data that's produced then gets monetized in a very specific and privatized way, and whether that we don't have to think about or be mindful of the extent to which translation is an objet citoyen. It's part of this kind of public good, and one of the proposals being put forward by a number of American commentators is that rather than having the data as capital model, which is where you monetize publicly funded resources, you have the data as labor model, so that every time a company uses your data, that they would have to pay for it. That there would be, in other words, you would be remunerated for the data that you are now providing in a particular way. So, I mean, there are various ways we might think about this, but I think it is urgent that we think about this question of extractivism in terms of what we do as translators.
Well, so thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Alexandra, and I have a small question to Damien MEADOWS. And my question is, how does DG Climate Action cooperate with translators? How it looks like this cooperation?
I'm glad to say in the past, I mean, one of the people who mentored me when I began 2 decades ago, he used to come to meet the translators and discuss the texts because of the jargon and things in there. We are the smallest commission DG. We are a fraction of the size of any of the others, about 160 people. So I've got to say, I mean, if Europe's taking climate at all seriously, it would be really helpful to have some more, because a colleague was talking to me about some questions translators had this morning on different values. I don't think we do as well as we could, because we're just so such a small DG with a lot being put on our shoulders. So I ask all of you, I mean, if you think we can do more, I think are all personally motivated on this problem. You can't know the science and not be. And we would like to make your lives easier because there is no legislation in Europe without it being translated.
Have a workload at this session either, but I will just mention very few things which popped into my mind while listening to our brilliant panelists. Obviously, interaction is key, and translation is choosing. So whether we should translate more or less, which is a very interesting and open question. What I will take back from this session is that we have to do it consciously, and so that will be our conclusion. So thank you again for our panelists, which